Stop grabbing me! I'm not your float!
Your chest is the safest place here.
We met 10 minutes ago.
On my planet, this means I've chosen you.
Chosen me for what?
For life.
What did you activate?
Our royal bonding protocol.
You married me?
Cole Hargrove arrived at Stellar Drift with 2 changes of clothes, no particular plan, and a well-practiced policy of not caring about things he could not shoot. The transit shuttle from Tessera Station had taken 9 hours, and he had spent most of them in the rear cabin in a posture that resembled sleep closely enough that no one had bothered him. He was good at that. He was good at a number of things that were no longer relevant to his current situation. Reading cargo routes for potential insertion points, identifying stress fractures in hull, plating at 40 meters, understanding which exit in a crowded room could support the weight of 2 people moving fast. These were the skills of someone who had been somewhere useful. Cole had not been somewhere useful for the better part of 18 months, and he had developed a complicated relationship with the fact that he did not entirely regret why. What he was currently was Admiral Chen's diplomatic problem. The Galactic Assembly vote was in 13 days. The Human Alliance had a strategy, a delegation, and a carefully constructed legal argument for why humanity's continued membership in the Galactic Accord was not only justified, but necessary for the stability of the entire interstellar community. What the Alliance did not need, anywhere near the proceedings, was the human who had refused a direct order during the Larathi border incident 18 months ago, who had put his service record and his rank and his entire career in front of an order to bombard a civilian transit station and said, calmly and in writing, no, and whose documented history had subsequently become Exhibit 7 in the Accord Division's case that humans were constitutionally incapable of functioning within established galactic protocol. Admiral Chen had explained all of this to him with the careful patience of someone who respected him too much to be dishonest about it and too professional to be honest about it all the way. You are not being sidelined, she had said, and her eyes had said the opposite with the kind of clarity that only came from many years of working with people who watched eyes for a living. You are being strategically repositioned to a neutral venue where your presence reinforces the Alliance's position that we are a people capable of cultural participation and leisure. It's a resort, Cole said. It's an important neutral diplomatic ecosystem. A pause.
Yes.
It's a resort. So, Cole was at Stellar Drift, which orbited the outer edge of the Orith Nebula, a structure roughly 30 light-years across, the remnant of a star that had died before humanity had developed agriculture, which had spent the intervening time doing something to itself that no physicist had yet managed to describe without also, eventually, describing it as beautiful. The nebula filled the viewport of his room like a living thing, slow and luminous, cycling through blues and golds and a deep violet that arrived every 40 minutes when the internal charge differential shifted. He stood at the window for a moment, looked at it, and then went to look at the drift chamber. The drift chamber was the reason that Stellar Drift existed. It occupied the center of the station like a heart 300 meters across and 100 meters high, sealed from vacuum by electromagnetic containment and physical that the station's engineering team tested every 12 hours. Inside those barriers, the ionized medium of the nebula had been compressed and filtered into something breathable, something buoyant, something lit from below by the nebula's own slow pulse in a way that made the light seem to come from no particular direction and everywhere at once. The ceiling of the chamber was set to transparency, which meant that floating inside it meant floating with the full spread of the Orith Nebula above you. The scale of that had a way of reducing most things to a size that could be managed. The station called it the Galaxy Pool. The marketing team had apparently been very pleased with themselves about that. Cole changed into civilian clothes, made his way to the entry platform, and stepped off the edge. The drift medium caught him immediately and completely. For a moment, the unfamiliarity of it was total, not the controlled disorientation of zero-gravity training, where you still had reference points and objectives, but something slower, warmer, a buoyancy that seemed to come from all directions simultaneously. He went still, the way he had learned to go still in many different environments, and waited for his body to stop expecting gravity and start trusting the situation. The medium held him. He breathed out and floated. He floated on his back and looked at the nebula through the ceiling, and was honest enough with himself to admit, privately, that it was doing something to him that he had not expected. Not comfort, not peace. Something more like the feeling of walking outside on a night when the sky is clear and very cold, and the stars are close enough to feel like a fact rather than a metaphor. The feeling of being very small in a way that was, somehow, a relief. The nebula had been dying for 10,000 years. It would keep dying for another 10,000. The question of whether humanity stayed in the galactic accord was, in the context of the Oerth Nebula, approximately the size of a dust particle. That was either very depressing or very useful, and Cole chose useful on the basis of habit. Other guests drifted in the chamber around him, in the calm, unhurried way of beings who had come to stellar drift specifically to drift and be unhurried. A Crescent family cluster near the center of the chamber. 3 of the adults keeping gentle hands on the tethers of the smaller ones who were still adjusting to the buoyancy. 2 Thessians near the far wall in health biosuits, attending for medical rather than recreational reasons. A loose group of Halvari near the south end, their lateral fins occasionally breaking the surface of the medium with a sound like a low note struck on something resonant and then held. Cole was not looking for anything. He was doing the closest approximation to nothing that he knew how to do. The sound that reached him after about 30 minutes was not exactly a sound. It was an absence, the particular quality of quiet that his body had learned to identify over 14 years of professional practice as the sound a person makes when they are trying very hard not to make any sound at all. He turned his head without moving the rest of his body, slowly, and scanned the chamber. She was near the east wall, at the point where the drift medium thinned toward one of the secondary circulation channels. Lirathi, he cataloged details in the order that mattered from long habit. The bioluminescence along the jaw and collarbone, dim now and unsteady, cycling between pale gold and something closer to gray. The elongated fingers wrapped around the guide rope at the channel's edge. The body very still, with the specific stillness of someone using control as a substitute for a better option they did not currently have. The secondary circulation channel was running high. He clocked that in the first second. It should not have been running that high, as the station's circulation system was supposed to balance automatically. And if the east secondary was this strong, it meant something in the balancing system had failed, which meant the guide rope along that wall was taking more load than it was rated for, which meant the anchor fittings the fitting gave way. It did not fail dramatically. Guide ropes in drift chambers were rated for loads that would seem absurd in a gravity environment, and they did not snap the way cables in old stories snapped. What happened was that the wall anchor, corroded by years of current and almost certainly overdue for a replacement that had been scheduled and deferred twice, simply released. The rope went slack. The current had been waiting for exactly this. It took her within 2 seconds. Cole was already moving before the rope was fully loose. He moved through the drift medium, the way he had learned, to move through every kind of resistance, with the absolute economy of someone who had done the calculation and was now purely executing it. He read the current's angle, read the intake position on the far wall, calculated the rate of acceleration as the current narrowed toward the maintenance grill. He moved to the intercept point. He did not think about it. 14 years of training meant that the thinking had already happened before he was consciously aware of it. He caught her arm 4 meters from the intake. The current was stronger than it looked. Drift medium had mass, and mass in motion carried momentum. And the intake was pulling at the current from below in a way that made the effective force considerably more than the surface reading. Cole turned his body sideways to the current maximum drag. Minimum forward velocity wrapped his free arm around her from behind, found the edge of the maintenance channel wall with his feet, and pushed off it with everything that his legs had. For approximately 3 seconds, the outcome was genuinely uncertain. He could see the maintenance grill, at close range the specific pattern of the grating, the cycling indicator light of the intake mechanism behind it. The pressure differential visible in the way the medium distorted near the surface of the grill. His shoulders burned along specific seams that he knew from experience were exactly the seams that would burn. He pushed harder. They cleared the intake zone. The current fell off rapidly on the stable side. They drifted together back into the center of the chamber, and the burning in his shoulders reduced from acute to something he would feel tomorrow, and his heart was doing something that it had not done since the last time someone had discharged a weapon in his direction, which was, to be honest about it, the closest comparison he had. She was shaking. Not visibly, her body was too managed for it to be visible. Whatever training had produced that management. But he could feel it because she was pressed against him, and the shaking was in the muscles, rather than the surface. The kind of internal tremor that came before the external one when someone was working very hard to hold themselves together. He kept them still. He did not speak, did not try to reposition her, did not perform any of the actions that a person performing a rescue would perform to signal that the rescue was over. He kept his arm around her, and his breathing even, and watched the maintenance intake from across the chamber in case the current cycled again, which it did not, and he let the stillness do its work. Her grip on his arm loosened over the next several minutes, not all at once, not by any decision he could identify, but in increments. The way tension leaves a body when the body finally accepts that the threat level has changed. And somewhere in those minutes, she stopped holding herself carefully angled away from him, which was the precise and well-managed posture she had maintained since the moment he caught her, and simply settled. Her weight came to rest against his chest. Her head was near his sternum. The drift medium held them both with complete indifference to any of it. He became aware, after another minute, that her fingers, which had been gripping his arm and had gradually relaxed to resting, were now tapping. Slow, quiet, rhythmic, in exact time with his heartbeat. She was not doing it consciously. He was quite certain of that. She was in the suspension that comes after sustained adrenaline, not quite present and not quite gone, and her fingers had found a steady rhythm and were tracking it the way a second instrument tracks a first without being told to. His heartbeat was steady. He was, in most circumstances, physically steady. He had put some effort into that over the years, and it showed up in places like this. He stayed still and let her track it. The nebula light moved through its gold phase and into the deep violet, and the chamber's sound dampening reduced the ambient noise to something close to actual silence. And he was aware of the rhythm of his own heartbeat and the faint, unconscious echo of it in her fingers, and of the dying light of a 10,000-year-old star cycling above them. And he did not try to make anything useful out of any of it. When she lifted her head, the violet had already given way to the first wash of the next blue cycle, and close to 15 minutes had passed. "Thank you," she said. Her standard was precise and slightly formal, with the formality of a second language learned excellently and spoken carefully. "I apologize for the disruption." "No disruption," he said. He kept his voice level. "The anchor fitting on that guide rope needed replacing. That's a station maintenance failure. I'll log it." "Yes." She was looking at him with pale amber eyes that were doing something complicated. "You moved very quickly. Military background. The instinct doesn't go off duty." He adjusted his arm slightly, not withdrawing support, but making clear there was an option if she wanted more distance. "How are you doing?" "I am fine," she said, with the automation of someone who had used those 3 words many times as a conversation management tool and was not necessarily reporting a factual condition. He recognized the technique intimately. "You were 4 meters from a cycling intake," he said. "You're allowed to not be fine for a few minutes. The medium will hold you regardless." She looked at him for a moment, and something in the precise management of her expression shifted a very small change, but enough that he noticed it, and enough that it looked like something she hadn't entirely planned. He said, because the silence had reached a length where something needed to fill it, "I've been court-martialed, stripped of rank, and told by 3 separate admirals that I have a gift for ending my own career. But this is genuinely new territory." She blinked. "Pardon?" "Emergency flotation device."
He nodded very slightly at himself at the general situation of her still resting against him in the drift medium of an interstellar resort. "New role."
Something moved through her expression and resolved, after a moment, into something that his xenobiology training was not quite precise enough to categorize, but that he was willing, provisionally, to call amusement. "Vale," she said. "My name is Vale. Cole Hargrove." She was still for 1 beat that was exactly 1 beat too long. "I know," she said. And then the openness that had been in her face just for a moment, just in the bioluminescence cycling back to gold and the drift medium holding them both closed again, quickly and deliberately, like a door being closed with care rather than slammed. He filed it. He did not say anything about it. She moved then, carefully repositioning herself in the drift medium, with the particular fluid grace of someone who knew their body well in unusual environments. She was upright now, the professional distance restored to her posture, and she was preparing to say something that would end the interaction: a formal thank you, an apology for the imposition, a careful withdrawal. He said, before she could, sit with it another minute. The physiological response to acute stress takes about 20 minutes to fully clear through the system. Moving too fast causes secondary dizziness in most species. She looked at him with an expression he could not fully read. Not hostility, something more calibrated than that. Military medical training, he said. Same old instinct. After a pause, she stilled again. Not the soft, unconscious settling of a few minutes before. This was deliberate, managed, but she stayed. They did not talk much in the time that followed. He pointed out the way the nebula light changed at the transition between the violet phase and the return blue. The moment when the charged particles became individually visible against the larger field, so that for roughly 90 seconds the ceiling looked like it was made of separate and distinct light, rather than one continuous luminescence, like a sky full of stars that each had a name. She watched it and said very little. Once, at the transition, she made a sound that was clearly involuntary, and clearly indicated that the sight of the Orith Nebula at its transition point had done something to her that she had not arranged for it to do. He understood that exactly. When she finally moved to leave, she did so with the deliberate care of someone thinking through each motion before executing it, and she did not look back, and he let her go. He stayed in the drift medium for another hour. He was not thinking about anything specific, which was unusual for him and which he chose not to examine. 3 hours later, he was in the station's public dining deck, with a mediocre meal he was not particularly attending to, running an idle check on the current station population because 18 months of political complexity had rewired some of his default behaviors in ways he could not fully undo. The name Vale was uncommon. He had 3 results immediately. 2 were clearly not her. The third was registered under Accord Division diplomatic security codes that took him 4 minutes to get through, because he had spent a lot of years learning how those codes were structured, and they had not changed the architecture much. First witness, Lirathi diplomatic caste, 3rd ring, Accord Division assignment, current station, Stellar Drift. Duration, 11 days. Purpose, observational cultural liaison. He read the purpose designation twice. He knew what it meant. The language of official designations was the language of actual intent with the adjectives rearranged. An observational cultural liaison from the Accord Division, 11 days before the Assembly vote on humanity's status, meant witness. It meant evidence gathering. It meant that the Lirathi, who had spent 15 minutes lying on his chest in the drift chamber, had been sent here to watch him, to document what she observed about his behavior in an unguarded environment, and that what she documented would be presented to the Galactic Assembly as evidence in the case to remove humanity from the Accord. He sat with his mediocre food and this information for quite a long time. He thought about her fingers tapping against his arm in exact rhythm with his heartbeat without her noticing she was doing it. He thought about the sound she had made at the nebula's transition. He thought about "I know," in the voice of someone who had known his name before he gave it and had not intended to reveal that. He was still sitting there, not eating, thinking about all of it, when she appeared in the dining deck entrance. She came across the room to his table and stopped and said, "May I sit?" with the composure of someone who had decided to do something that the decision-making part of them was not entirely certain about. "Sure," he said. She sat and folded her hands on the table, with the precision of someone who used physical organization as a form of self-management, a technique he recognized because it was one of his own. She said, after a moment, "I am aware that you have likely identified my diplomatic registration." "Wasn't difficult," he said. "No," a pause. "I should have disclosed it earlier. I intended to disclose it. I had not determined the correct approach." He looked at her across the table. "Why tell me now?" "Because, in the drift chamber," she said carefully, "you behaved in ways that my prepared observational framework did not accommodate. And I am," she stopped, "reorganized. I am a scientist before I am a diplomat. When observed data does not match the predictive model, the appropriate response is to re-examine the model, not to discard the data because it is inconvenient. What were you expecting? My briefings described humans as reactive, emotionally impulsive, and likely to perform positive behaviors. When in the presence of an audience, she said, there was an audience in the drift chamber. You performed a positive behavior, but the performance hypothesis does not account for the quality of what followed. Her eyes were steady on his face. You were not performing. People who are performing behave differently in the 15 minutes after the performance ends. You did not. Cole looked at her for a moment. I just didn't want you to go into an intake. Yes, she said, that is the anomaly. He looked at the mediocre food and the nebula light coming through the dining deck windows and the way it caught the bioluminescence along her jaw, and he said, if you're going to keep observing me either way, I'd rather know about it. That seems more honest, she said. All right. He picked up his forward hands his mermaid and improved. No, you should know I'm a very poor subject. I float. I eat food that isn't good. I haven't done anything particularly instructive since I arrived. She looked at his meal with an expression that appeared to confirm his assessment of its quality. I have found Stellaverdrift's food offerings to be approximately adequate, she said. High praise. I don't offer praise without a basis for it, and the specific measurement of it, the refusal to give more than she could struck him as being approximately the most honest thing anyone had said to him in a long time. The nebula light moved through the dining deck windows and caught the bioluminescence along her jaw, and she was looking at him with the precise attention of someone who had come here to document a species and was no longer certain what she was documenting. Will you stay? She asked, and it came out differently than everything before it, less measured, more direct, like something that had made the decision to be said before she had made the decision to say it, just a little longer. I would like to continue the conversation. Cole looked at the drift chamber through the window. He looked at his mediocre food. He looked at her. Sure, he said. The next 2 days at Stellar Drift had a quality that Cole did not have good language for, and therefore declined to think about in language. He thought about it instead, the way he thought about most things that resisted categorization, by watching and waiting for more data and being honest with himself about what the data was actually showing him. What it showed him was this: Vale was not behaving like a witness. She was behaving like a scientist with a bad case of cognitive dissonance, and he was watching it happen with the specific attention of someone who had spent 14 years reading people in situations where reading them accurately was a matter of consequence. She took notes. She made observations. She asked him questions that were clearly structured around a framework she had prepared before arriving. And then she listened to his answers with the kind of careful, entirely visible frustration of someone whose framework was not giving her the results she expected. She expected, he understood gradually, to find the thing her briefings had told her was there: the impulsiveness, the volatility, the capacity for dramatic destabilization that the Accord Division had apparently built its case on. She was looking for it the way a chemist looks for a reaction that the formula predicts should happen, and the reaction was not happening, and she was too intellectually honest to pretend otherwise. On the afternoon of the first day, she asked him, directly and without a great deal of preamble, why he had refused the bombing order. They were in the drift chamber. He was floating on his back in the way he had begun to find useful for thinking. She was beside him, more upright, the Larathi preference for visual orientation, meaning she rarely fully reclined in the medium. He said, because there were 900 civilians on that station. Yes, she said, but the order was given under Accord authorization. The station was in a contested sector. The legal framework, he said I could. It didn't say I had to. He looked at the nebula above them. I've been trained to follow orders under the assumption that the orders have been thought through by people with better situational information than I have. That assumption has a load limit. When someone in an office at Tessara runs a calculation that says 900 civilian lives are an acceptable expenditure for a tactical advantage, I couldn't assess and they couldn't explain. I've reached the load limit. Vale was quiet for a moment. Your career, she said. My career ended when I signed the formal protest, he said. The station didn't. She wrote something on her recording device. He did not ask what. That was the agreement they had reached. She was honest about being here to observe him, and he was honest about what she observed. The honesty was strange but manageable. What was less manageable, and what he was watching with increasing attention, was the other thing. It started on the first afternoon About 2 hours after their conversation in the drift chamber, she went very still. In the middle of a sentence, she was asking him about the Lirathi border sector's resource disputes, which was very much a prepared question from a prepared framework, and she went still the way people still when they are trying to locate a sound, not alarmed. "What?" he said. She shook her head slightly. "Nothing. I thought I heard." She stopped. "Nothing." He watched her, noted on her device. He said nothing. It happened again the next morning when they were eating in the dining deck. He had developed, against all intention, a habit of eating mediocre food across a table from her, because she appeared to have developed an equivalent habit, and the simplest response to this was to continue. She was mid-sentence about the structural inadequacies of the Accord's conflict resolution protocols, which was not a prepared question, he had noticed, but something she actually thought about when she paused again. The same quality of stillness. The same listening expression. "There it is again," she said, mostly to herself. "What is a sound?" She looked at him with a slight furrow between her eyes that he had not seen on her face before. "A low frequency, rhythmic." She paused. "I'm not certain it's actually audible. It may be a physiological effect of the nebula environment. The Oerth Nebula's electromagnetic field interacts differently with Lirathi neurological structure than with most species. There's documented literature on auditory effects." "Could be," Cole said. She wrote something on her device. She did not look entirely convinced. On the second afternoon, she disappeared for an hour. He was not looking for her. Exactly, he was doing a circuit of the station's outer observation ring. 'Cause walking was useful for the specific kind of restlessness that had been building in him since he arrived, and that he could not entirely attribute to the assembly vote. When she found him at the far end of the ring, she had the expression of someone who had looked something up and was not certain what to do with what they had found. "I accessed my device's archive of Lirathi historical texts," she said. "I was cross-referencing the auditory anomaly with documented environmental effects." She stopped, and I found a passage. She paused again. He had noticed that she paused when she was being careful, not uncertain, but careful, the way someone is careful with a piece of information they are still evaluating. It is from the Sovan Compendium, pre-Akkad, approximately 9,000 years old. The passage describes a frequency called the Yathara, translated approximately as the echo of the world makers. The text states that this frequency would be heard only by those of Lirathi descent when in proximity to. She stopped. "To what?" "The text is metaphorical at that point," she said. "Ancient Lirathi, religious and historical texts frequently use metaphor in a way that makes direct translation difficult. The passage uses the phrase, 'the last voice of those who shaped the first silence.'" She was looking at him with the amber precision that he was beginning to be able to read at its edges, and the edges were showing him something that she was not certain, yet she wanted to show. "I closed the archive. It is almost certainly coincidence and mythology." "Almost certainly," Cole said. She looked at him for a moment longer than the sentence required. Then she went back to her observations, and he went back to his circuit of the observation ring, and neither of them said anything more about it, and the afternoon passed, and the nebula cycled through its colors. Valdhari Prime Sarith arrived at Stellar Drift on the morning of the third day. Cole was in the station's main atrium when the delegation shuttle docked, a Valdhari vessel, compact and efficient, with the specific angular geometry that distinguished Valdhari design from every other spacefaring species aesthetic. He knew the Valdhari crest. Most Alliance Navy officers knew it from the border briefings. The Valdhari were the faction in the Galactic Assembly who had been pushing hardest for humanity's expulsion, and their representative to the Accord Division was, by all accounts, a man named Sarith, who had been building the case against humanity for 3 years with the systematic patience of someone who considered the outcome inevitable and was simply completing the documentation. Cole watched the delegation come through the atrium. Sarith was easy to identify. Valdhari physiognomy ran toward height and a gray-blue skin tone that deepened near the temples, and Sarith was taller than most of his delegation and had the particular kind of stillness that Cole associated, from long experience, with people who were accustomed to being the most dangerous thing in whatever room they were in. Sarith crossed the atrium with his delegation, and his eyes moved across the space in the way of a person who was assessing it systematically, and for a moment they landed on Cole. Cole was a man who had been under the professional attention of a great number of very capable people over the course of his career, and he had developed a fairly calibrated sense of what different kinds of attention felt like. Sareth's attention, in the 3 seconds it rested on him, felt like something that had already made its calculation and was checking, very briefly, that the calculation still held. Not hostility, not interest, the specific quality of attention you gave to a variable you had already accounted for. Then Sareth's attention moved on, and Cole was no longer a variable, and the delegation continued across the atrium toward the administrative wing. He found Vale in the drift chamber 2 hours later. She was not floating, she was near the entry platform, and she had the posture of someone who had been trying to do something and had not managed to do it. When she saw him, she straightened, which told him something. "Sareth is here," he said. Yes. She was holding her recording device with a grip that was slightly tighter than necessary. He requested a briefing. He wants the preliminary report by tomorrow morning. Cole looked at her. "What does your preliminary report say?" She looked at her recording device. "Currently it says very little that is useful to the Accord Division's case," she said, with the tone of someone stating a problem they are not certain how to solve. "Is that why you came to the drift chamber?" "I came to the drift chamber because I need to think," she said, and then, with a slight shift in her expression that told him she had not entirely intended to say that and was not going to take it back, "and the drift chamber is easier for thinking than the consultation room where Sareth's staff have set up their equipment." Cole looked at the entry platform, and then at her, and then at the nebula visible through the ceiling and said, "Then let's think." They floated for most of the afternoon. Vale was less present than usual. She floated with a slight distance between them, not unfriendly but occupied, the expression of someone running something through their mind repeatedly. He gave her the space and concentrated on the view and the rhythm of his own breathing, which was steady, in the way it always was when there was something he could not yet act on and could only wait for. At one point she said quietly, to the nebula rather than to him, "In my field of study, when an observational protocol begins generating results that consistently contradict the hypothesis, the accepted methodology is to revise the hypothesis, not to falsify the results." He said, equally to the nebula, "Sounds right. The Accord Division's hypothesis is that humans are inherently destabilizing," she said, "prone to impulsive action, incapable of sustained structural compliance, likely to introduce chaos into systems that depend on predictability." She paused. "My observational results do not support this hypothesis." "What do they support?" Another pause, longer. "That humans make decisions on the basis of principles that are not always the same as the principles that Galactic Protocol uses to make decisions," she said carefully, "and that the difference between those two systems produces what looks like instability from the outside, but may be something different when observed at close range." He thought about the 900 civilians. "What's it look like at close range?" She was quiet for a long time. "Like someone who has decided that a calculation has been done wrong," she said, "and is willing to pay the personal cost of saying so." Cole looked at the nebula. He did not say anything. The medium held them both. That evening, Sareth came to the drift chamber. Cole saw him from across the chamber, standing on the entry platform in the very particular way of someone who was not there to float, who was there to have a conversation that required a specific location. He watched Sareth scan the chamber, and he watched Sareth's attention find Vale, who was still in the medium, and he watched what happened to Sareth's expression when it did. Sareth's expression did not change. That was the thing. Most beings, when they found who they were looking for, showed some register relief, acknowledgement, the small unconscious animation of a face finding its target. Sareth showed nothing, but something in his body changed very slightly, and Cole, who had spent a great deal of his professional life reading what bodies did when faces were trying not to show anything, read it. Sareth saw Vale in proximity to Cole, and he did not like it, in a way that had nothing to do with the diplomatic mission and everything to do with something else. Something that produced, in a man who was clearly accustomed to having complete control over his reactions, a barely perceptible stiffening in the space between his shoulder blades. Cole filed it. He filed it carefully, the way he filed things that he did not yet have enough context for, but that his instincts were telling him were important. Sareth gestured to Vale from the platform. She made her way to the edge of the medium and climbed out, and they spoke in low voices, that the chamber's sound dampening prevented Cole from making out. He watched Sareth's body language and Vale's body language and the difference between them, and the difference was that Vale was braced and Sareth was not, which meant the conversation was one that Sareth had arranged and controlled, and she was navigating. They were done in 5 minutes. Sareth left the chamber the way he had entered it, precisely, efficiently, without wasted movement. Vale stood at the platform edge for a moment after he left, looking at nothing in particular, with an expression that was doing a great deal of careful management. Cole waited until she was back in the medium before he said, "What was that?" "He wants the final report," she said, "not the preliminary. The final report, by tomorrow evening." She paused. "He has moved the timeline. Why?" She was quiet for a moment. He did not say. She looked at her hands below the surface of the medium, drifting slightly in the current. He also asked whether my observations had been conducted at the appropriate and professional distance. A pause. He said appropriate, the specific word he used. Cole looked at where Sareth had been standing. He thought about the thing he had read in the body language, the thing that was not about the diplomatic mission, and he thought about Vel saying that she had found a passage in a 9,000-year-old text about a frequency, and that she had closed the archive because it was almost certainly coincidence and mythology. He thought, something about me specifically is making Sareth nervous. That was interesting. A man who ran the Accord Division's case against an entire species was not typically nervous about individual humans. Cole was not a general or a weapons designer or anyone of particular strategic consequence. He was a disgraced mid-level officer who had refused a bombing order and had not done anything remarkable since. There was no reason for Sareth to react to him the way that body reacted, unless Sareth was nervous about something that had nothing to do with Cole's individual strategic value. He did not say any of this to Vale. He said, "Are you going to file the final report by tomorrow evening?" She looked at the medium drifting around her hands. "I don't know," she said, which was the most honest answer he had gotten from anyone in a very long time. The nebula cycled through violet and back to blue, and the chamber was quiet around them. And somewhere in the distance, the Valdari shuttle sat in its dock, and Sareth's staff prepared their equipment, and tomorrow's timeline moved toward them like a tide. Cole found her at the observation ring at 7 in the morning. Station time, which was earlier than either of them had been in the habit of appearing there. She was standing at the window that faced the nebula's densest region, the area near the Orith core that even the station's transparency technology rendered slightly out of focus, as though the concentrated light of a dying star was too much for any instrument designed for ordinary seeing. He stood next to her without saying anything first. He was not good at preambles, and she had figured that out by now. "You know who I am," she said. Not a question. She had been thinking. He could tell, since before he arrived. "You know who you are," he said. "I found out about 3 days ago." "Yes." She did not look at him. Her bioluminescence was running low this morning, a pale, tired gold, rather than the clear warmth he had come to recognize as her resting state. "And you did not say anything." "I was waiting to see what you were going to do." She turned to look at him then, and her expression was the expression of someone who had decided to stop managing and just look at the thing directly. "I was sent here to observe you," she said, "to produce a report documenting your behavior for the Accord Division's presentation to the Assembly."
The report was intended to demonstrate that your actions during the Larathi border incident 18 months ago were representative of a broader pattern of human behavioral instability. She paused.
"That is the mission I was given, and the reason I am here, I know," Cole said. "What I have documented is not that." She looked at her hands. "What I have documented is a human who refused an order because the order required killing 900 people who were not combatants, who, when presented with an opportunity to perform positive behavior for an audience, did not perform, who explains his reasoning in terms of principles that are internally consistent and coherent, and that, when I examine them carefully, I cannot find a structural flaw in." She stopped. "The report I have been asked to produce and the observations I have made are incompatible." "So what are you going to do?" Cole said. She was quiet for a moment that felt like a decision being made. "I think," she said slowly, "that I was going to tell you that I intend to submit the factual record of my observations rather than the report the division expects, and that this will—" She stopped. This will be professionally consequential for me. Significantly. He looked at the nebula. Then he looked at her. You don't have to do that, he said. No, she said. I don't have to. She met his eyes. But in the drift medium 2 days ago, I told you what I thought the data showed. And I am not comfortable, Cole, with the idea of submitting a document that says the opposite of what the data shows. I am not built for that. I have tried, this morning, to write a report that the division would find satisfactory, and I cannot make myself finish it. He believed her. That was the problem. He believed her completely, and he could feel underneath the part of him that was trained and practical and understood how these situations worked, the particular pull of wanting to believe that the belief was warranted, that the 15 minutes in the drift medium had been what it appeared to be, that the things she said about the data were actually about the data and not about something she was managing for reasons he could not see. He knew what that pull was. He had felt it before in different circumstances. He also knew what it had cost him every time he had followed it, and found out afterward that the situation had been more complicated than it looked. He thought about Admiral Chen's voice on the comm 3 nights before he arrived at Stellar Drift, telling him that the Alliance's strategy required exactly this. Required that he be visible and unremarkable and not complicated, and that complications was the one thing he genuinely could not afford right now. He thought about the 14 years before the border incident, and the 14 months since it, and the kind of weight that accumulated when you stopped trusting your own judgment about people. He said, I have to report this to the Alliance delegation. She was very still. Report what? That you're a first witness, that you've been observing me. That there's a Valdari Prime representative on this station applying direct pressure to your mission timeline. He kept his voice level. That's information the Alliance delegation needs to have. She looked at him for a long time. Her bioluminescence was very dim. That's not...
She stopped. Cole, I just told you that I was going to submit the actual record. I told you in confidence.
I understand that, he said, and I believe you mean it. He paused, but I can't verify it. The people making decisions about humanity's status in the next 11 days can't verify it either. What they can verify is that someone from the Accord Division is on this station and moving up timelines, and that's the information I have to pass on. She looked at him for a moment that was somewhere between the length of a breath and the length of something much longer. Then she said quietly, You made the same calculation once before. You decided that the rules required you to act regardless of what it would cost you personally, and the system still did the wrong thing. Yes, he said, and you're doing it again. He didn't answer. It was not really a question. She looked at the nebula, and he looked at the nebula, and the dying star continued doing what it had been doing for 10,000 years, which was dying beautifully and slowly, and without regard for any of it. He filed his report to the Alliance delegation that afternoon through the standard secure channel. He kept it factual, the presence of a first witness on station, Sareth's arrival accelerated timeline, the observed pressure on the witness's reporting schedule. He did not include the conversations in the drift chamber or the dining deck. He did not include the way she had said, I know, when he gave her his name, or the 15 minutes of silence in the medium, or the sound she had made at the nebula's transition point. Those were not data the Alliance delegation needed, and they were not data he was willing to give. What happened next he did not see directly, because the station's administrative structure separated the diplomatic operations from the guest areas in ways that were not subtle. What he understood afterward, through the specific quality of Vale's absence, she did not appear in the drift chamber that afternoon, or in the dining deck, or at the observation ring, was that the Alliance delegation had done something with his report, and that something had intersected with what Sareth had already been doing, and that the result was that Vale had been removed from the situation. He was wrong about exactly what had happened, but not wrong about the shape of it. What happened was that Sareth, the moment he was informed by his own networks that Vale had expressed intent to deviate from her assigned report, moved with the kind of speed that came from having contingency plans for contingencies. He requested a formal meeting with Vale under the provisions of the Larathi Observers Compact, a provision that allowed Accord representatives to conduct a coherence review with a deployed witness whose reports showed signs of environmental influence on observational objectivity. The provision existed because the Accord Division had created it specifically for situations like this one, and Sareth had been involved in drafting it. The coherence review involved, among other things, what the compact described as realignment of perceptual anchors, a process that, in practice, meant a carefully applied pharmaceutical and a trained Accord neurological specialist and 40 minutes in a consultation room, after which Vale's memory of the last 3 days contained the correct sequence of events, but the emotional and intuitive coloring of those events had been smoothed to something that aligned more cleanly with the mission parameters she had been given. The sound she had been hearing, the low frequencies she had been tracking and writing in her notes and had described once as rhythmic, was gone. She had no memory of closing an archive of ancient Lirathi texts or of the passage about the Yathara. She had a report to write and a deadline to meet, and the report was taking shape in the way reports were supposed to take shape. Cole did not know about the coherence review. He knew Vale was gone from the spaces where they had been, and that the shape of it felt wrong to him in the way that wrong things felt when you had been trained to notice the difference. And he was in the observation ring at the far end, not thinking about anything in particular, when the elderly Lirathi found him. The Lirathi was very old. Cole knew Lirathi age indicators imprecisely, but the dimness of the bioluminescence and the careful, considered quality of movement were things he associated with age in most species. The old Lirathi stopped 3 feet from him and looked at him with eyes that were amber like Vale's but darker, and said, in standard that was rougher and more accented than Vale's, "You are the human she was listening to." Cole said, "I'm sorry, in the drift medium," the old Lirathi said. "She was listening to you. Here." He pressed one hand briefly to his own sternum. "To what is in here?" Cole said carefully, "Who are you?" "Elder Sovan," the old Lirathi said. "I am not a guest. I am not on the station manifest. I have been here for 5 days, and I have been watching what Sareth's people are doing, and I have been watching you, and I came to tell you something before they find me, and before you do something you cannot take back." Cole looked at him. "I'm listening." "She heard the Yathara," Elder Sovan said, "when she was in the medium near you. The sound she could not name, that is what it was." He paused. "Our oldest records say that the Yathara will be heard only when a Lirathi is in physical proximity to a descendant of the Makers. What the Makers made, among other things, was us, the Lirathi, and when one of us is near, one of them near the last of them, the ones who carry the frequency still in their living systems, the Yathara sounds." Cole was very still. "What are you saying?" "I am saying," Elder Sovan said, "that the Accord Division has done this for a very long time. I am saying that the reason Sareth is afraid of you, yes, I have watched him, and he is afraid. A man like that does not get afraid of specific humans. For no reason is that he knows that if a Lirathi hears the Yathara from a human, and if that Lirathi testifies to it under the resonance protocols, the assembly will not be able to proceed with the expulsion vote, because the resonance testimony will carry with it the complete biological record, the genetic memory of what we are, and where we come from and what humanity is to us, and that record cannot be falsified and cannot be legally dismissed." "That sounds," Cole said slowly, "like the kind of thing that someone would want to prevent." "Yes," Elder Sovan said, "which is why they have done to her whatever they have done to her today, and why they will find me within the next." He stopped, his head turned just slightly toward the corridor. "Within the next short while," he finished. "I need you to listen carefully." Cole listened. "She needs to hear the Yathara again," Elder Sovan said. "But for the resonance to be legally valid before the assembly, she needs to have undergone a full resonance scan, a biological recording of a Lirathi, hearing the Yathara from its source. The scan takes the hearing and the source frequency simultaneously and produces a document that the assembly's own protocols cannot dismiss." He reached into the worn bag at his side and withdrew a small device, roughly cylindrical, unassuming, the kind of thing that looked like a medical measuring tool and was one. "This is the scanner. It requires the consent of the source, the human providing the frequency. Signed consent in the system for the scan to be valid. And if I sign it," Cole said, "then whatever is in you, whatever the Makers left in you, however many generations back, whatever trace they left in the biology of this species that everyone in the galaxy has decided to stop looking for, because looking for it would require rethinking everything, will be on record. And when Vale stands before the assembly and that record plays, It will play with the authority of a Larathi resonance witness, and the Accord's own protocols will have to acknowledge it. He paused. Or Sareth can try to shut down the testimony, in which case the assembly will see exactly what is being hidden and why, and that will be its own kind of testimony. Cole held the scanner in his hands. It was lighter than he expected. He thought about 900 people on a station. He thought about the right thing and the cost of it. He thought about Admiral Chen telling him he was being strategically repositioned, and that complication was not what the Alliance needed. He thought about Vale's fingers tapping against his arm in rhythm with his heartbeat, without her knowing she was doing it. He thought about a 9,000-year-old archive, and a frequency with a name and a man, with the authority of the entire Accord division behind him who was, underneath all of it, afraid. He looked at the scanner. He thought about what he knew, and what he did not know, and the gap between them, and what it meant to act in that gap. He signed the consent form. She may not remember what she heard, he said. The Yathara is not a memory, Elder Sovans said. It is a recognition. You cannot make someone stop recognizing what they recognize. You can only prevent them from naming it. He took the scanner back with hands that were very steady for their age. When she stands before the assembly and the scanner activates, she will name it. They're going to arrest you, Cole said. Yes, Elder Sovan said. Fairly soon. He looked at Cole for a moment, with eyes that were dark and amber, and had the specific quality of eyes that had looked at a great many situations and made a great many decisions about what they required. Take care of her when it is done, he said. She will have paid a very high price. I know what that costs, Cole said. Yes, Elder Sovan said. I think you do. 3 Accord Division officers came into the observation ring 6 minutes later. Cole watched from the far end as they escorted Elder Sovan with the careful, deliberate technique of professionals who did not want a scene and were confident they were not going to get one. Elder Sovan did not resist. He went with them the way he had spoken, calmly, precisely, with the specific stillness of someone who had already done the thing they came to do. Cole stood in the observation ring and looked at the nebula. He had not saved a Larathi civilian station by not bombing it. He had not prevented anything exactly, because Sareth's people had still found a way to proceed, and the assembly vote was still in 11 days, and humanity's status was still entirely uncertain. He had done the right thing, and it had cost him most of his career. And the outcome had still been wrong. Maybe this would be different. Maybe it would not. He had stopped being able to predict those things with any confidence. He looked at the small blinking confirmation on his personal device that said the consent form had been received and filed. He looked at the nebula, 10,000 years of slow dying. Not caring about any of this one way or the other, he thought, I have made my bet. Then he went back to his room, set his alarm for 6 hours, and went to sleep because there was nothing else to do and he was very tired, and tomorrow was going to be whatever it was going to be. It was 40 minutes later, just before he reached full sleep, that his comm chimed with a message from a source that registered as Elder Sovan's identification code, which meant it had been queued before the Elder was taken and released on a timer. The message was 4 words. She heard your heartbeat. That is not coincidence. That is inheritance. Cole read it twice. Then he put the comm down and lay in the dark and listened to his own heartbeat, which was steady and ordinary and had apparently been carrying something in it for the last several thousand years without either of them knowing. The Galactic Assembly's provisional hearing chamber at Stellar Drift was not built for spectacle. It was a practical space, neutral-toned, acoustically designed for clarity of speech in 8 simultaneous languages, with seating for 42 representatives, and a witness platform that had been positioned in the center of the room, so that the speaker was equidistant from every faction present. The design was intended to convey the quality of fairness through the quality of geometry. Cole has spent his career in rooms designed to convey one thing while producing another, and he recognized the technique. He was not in the hearing chamber. He was in the waiting area outside it, which was a smaller practical space, with seating for people who were not yet required, and 2 guards at the inner door who were polite and were not going to let him through. The Alliance delegation had arranged this very specifically. Cole was a material witness who might be called and therefore needed to be accessible, but he was also a complication that needed to be managed and therefore needed to be here and not inside. He sat. He waited. He was good at waiting. The hard part was not knowing. Valdari Prime, Sareth opened the hearing. He had reviewed Cole's full record. Cole understood, which meant he had reviewed it in the 3 days since arriving at Stellar Drift and had added whatever additional documentation his people had gathered in that time. He spoke for approximately 40 minutes in a measured, careful voice that carried through the hearing chamber's acoustic system with the authority of someone who had organized evidence well and knew it. He described the border incident. He described the formal protocol violations. He described what he characterized as a pattern, not one human and one incident, but a systematic tendency in the species toward individualistic deviation from collective structures, the tendency being documented, he said, across a range of contexts and behavioral profiles. Cole could not hear this directly. He knew the shape of it from the Alliance delegation's briefing the previous night. What he could hear eventually was the change in the ambient sound from the other side of the door. Not the words. Just the shape of the sound, the way a room's acoustic character changes when the attention in it shifts. He had heard that shift in many rooms, and he knew what it meant. Something had happened that was not on the agenda. Inside the hearing chamber, Vale had been standing at the witness platform for approximately 6 minutes, reading from the document on her device in the careful, measured voice of a trained first witness. The Accord Division's realignment process had done its work. The report she was reading bore the factual observations she had made, the dates, the environmental details, the behavioral data points, with the emotional and intuitive connective tissue smoothed away, leaving what was technically accurate but directed toward the conclusion that the division needed. She was approximately halfway through the section on observed behavioral inconsistencies in the subject's compliance responses when the scanner activated. It was in the outer pocket of her document case. She had not consciously placed it there. She had found it there that morning, with no clear memory of receiving it, which was a side effect of the realignment process that Sareth had chosen to accept on the calculation that she would not examine her own equipment closely under time pressure. The scanner had been there, dormant, keyed to a specific biological signature and a consent code that had been filed the previous night. When she reached the passage in her report about the subject's tendency to misapply individual moral frameworks to structurally defined tactical situations, she said the phrase structurally defined, and the scanner's auditory pattern recognition, tuned to the exact frequency of Cole's heartbeat as recorded during the resonant scan consent process, matched the ambient acoustic signature in the room to a close enough approximation that it triggered, not a loud activation, a soft one, a gentle and precise one, like a key fitting a lock. The Yathara played through the room's acoustic system at a frequency below conscious hearing for most species in the chamber, and directly within Larathi neurological range. Vale stopped speaking. The room went very still. The kind of still that a room goes when something has happened that was not on the agenda and that everyone present is trying very rapidly to classify. Vale stood at the witness platform with her eyes closed, and the expression on her face was the expression of someone hearing something they had been trying to name for a very long time, hearing it clearly for the first time, and understanding, not deciding, not analyzing, not choosing understanding, the way a body understands things before the mind is given the chance to argue. The resonance memory came back all at once, not the carefully curated sequence that the realignment process had tried to leave her with. All of it, the drift medium and the current, and the feel of a heartbeat through a human chest, and the rhythm she had traced with her fingers without knowing she was doing it, and the sound she had been trying to name for 3 days, and the archive she had closed because it frightened her, and what the archive had said about the Yathara, and what Elder Sovan had said in the observation ring about the source of it, and the species that still carried it in the frequency of their living systems, without knowing they carried anything at all. She opened her eyes. "I need to amend my testimony," she said. The room stayed still. Sareth, in the representative section, had risen very slightly in his seat, not standing, but the quality of stillness in him had changed to something that Cole would have recognized instantly as a man who had reached for a contingency plan and was not yet certain which one to use. "First witness," said the assembly moderator Accretion. By the voice, female register, the careful neutrality of someone maintaining procedural order in a situation that had left procedure behind. "You are mid-testimony." "Amendments, Accord Original Article 7, Vale said. Her voice was perfectly steady. She had stopped shaking. Cole would have been able to tell. The way a person stops shaking when they have made a decision so complete that there is nothing left for the body to do with uncertainty. A Larathi resonance witness may not be silenced during active testimony. I am now testifying under resonance protocol. She lifted the scanner and pressed her palm to its activation surface. I am invoking that protocol now. The scanner opened. What it released into the room was not audible in the conventional sense. It was not a speech, and it was not a musical tone, and it was not anything that the hearing chamber's acoustic design had been built to transmit. It was a biological record, the collected and coded genetic memory of a Larathi lineage stretching back 9,000 years, not in the form of language, but in the form of the thing itself, the recognition, the inheritance, the record that a species carries in its cells of where it came from and what made it, which in the Larathi case was a species older than any currently present in the chamber, by a margin that the chamber's notation system could not easily accommodate. The record played. It played through the scanner's emission system and through Vale's own biology, simultaneously, and what the assembly saw was a first witness in the grip of something that was not performance and not distress and not any of the states that a witness was expected to demonstrate. What the assembly saw was a being in the act of recognition, the recognition of a frequency in the room that her lineage had been calibrated to respond to, and the recognition of what that frequency meant, and the full biological record of what it had always meant, opening in her the way old music opens in someone who has not heard it for a very long time and remembers it completely. The record contained, among other things, the genetic signature that the makers had left in Larathi biology, the specific marker that distinguished Larathi genome from every other recorded species that had been studied for 9,000 years without the researchers being able to identify what it was keyed to, because the thing it was keyed to had not been present in Larathi proximity for most of those 9,000 years. The record contained the same genetic marker, in a different form, the complementary form, the form of the source rather than the receiver as extracted from the resonance scan, that Cole Hargrove had consented to the previous night. The record contained, in the formal biological language that the assembly's own genetic verification systems could read and authenticate, the statement that these two genetic signatures were structurally related in the way that a signal and its receptor are related, that a human heartbeat carried, in its biological rhythm, the exact frequency of the maker technology that the Larathi genetics had been built to recognize, that this was not coincidence and was not mythology, and was not the kind of thing that could be dismissed by administrative means or procedural motion. That humanity was not the unstable newcomer at the edge of civilization, pressing its face against the window, asking to be let in. That humanity was the reason most of the people in the room existed at all. Sareth stood. This testimony is being conducted under irregular circumstances, he said, and his voice had the quality of a very controlled man holding a great deal of weight behind a wall that was still standing but was not going to stand much longer. The scanner in the witness's possession has not been submitted for verification. The resonance protocol has been invoked without prior filing. I move for a suspension of Article 7 of the Galactic Accord, the Crescent moderator said, with the tone of someone reading from a document they had not expected to need today, states, without qualification, that a Larathi resonance witness may not be interrupted or silenced during active resonance testimony. The motion for suspension is not procedurally available while the protocol is active. The protocol's activation was irregular. The protocol's activation requirements, the moderator said, are the presence of a Larathi first witness, the presence of a resonance scanner, the resonance scanner's biological consent record, and the witness's invocation. All four are present. A pause. The record before this assembly is authenticated by the scanner's own filing system and by the assembly's genetic verification protocols. It has been verified. Another pause. Longer. The record is entered. Sareth sat down. He did not slam his hands on the surface in front of him. He did not raise his voice or lose the control of his expression. He sat down with the precise, deliberate quality of a man who understood that one of his walls had come down and was calculating which of the others were still standing. In the waiting area, Cole heard the quality of the room's silence change again. He had been listening to it for what felt like a very long time, parsing the sounds through the door, not the words, which were mostly inaudible. but the acoustic character of the room, the way it felt when the weight shifted in it. He had heard the shift. He had heard the argument. He had heard what he thought was the moderator's voice delivering something, and then the silence after it. He did not know what had happened. He knew that something had. Vale stood at the witness platform for the remainder of the record's playback. When it was done, she set the scanner on the platform surface and said, in the steady voice of someone who had made the only decision available to them and was ready to live in whatever came after it, the record I have submitted to this assembly is the factual record of my observations and of the biological evidence I have encountered during the course of this assignment. I acknowledge that it deviates from the report I was expected to produce. I accept the professional consequences of that deviation. I ask that the assembly evaluate the evidence on its merits. Then she stepped back from the platform and stood, with her hands at her sides and her bioluminescence running at the low, steady gold of extreme fatigue, and waited for whatever came next. Outside, the door to the waiting area opened, and 2 Accord Division officers came through it, and they were polite and professional, and they told Cole that his presence in the hearing chamber was temporarily suspended, pending a review of the testimony that had just been entered, and that he would need to come with them. Cole looked at the 2 officers and then at the door to the hearing chamber, which was closing again, and thought about a great number of things very quickly. Then he went with them, because the alternative was a physical altercation in a space that was fully under Accord jurisdiction, and a physical altercation was not what this situation needed and was not going to help Vielle. He went with them, and the door closed, and he was in a room by himself with a low ceiling and no windows to the nebula, and he had no information about what was happening on the other side of the wall, and he was very good at waiting, and it was, right now, the hardest thing he had ever done. Inside the hearing chamber, the assembly was very quiet. Sareth was calculating. He was a man who had built careers on calculation, and right now he was calculating whether the evidence entered into the record was surmountable by any available procedural mechanism, and the calculation was not returning the results he needed. The genetic record was authenticated. The resonance protocol's invocation was legally valid. The scanner's consent filing was timestamped to the previous night, which was before any of the actions Sareth had taken that morning, which meant there was no procedural argument that the consent had been obtained under duress or as a result of subsequent events. And the genetic record itself, the biological documentation that was now formally entered into the Assembly's proceedings, said something that Sareth had been working for 3 years and longer to make sure it was never said in a room like this. He did the math. He had always been very good at math. And the math said that today was a loss, and that the question now was what kind of loss it would be, and whether there were still walls standing that could be protected. He reached for the walls that were still standing. He was not done yet. He was not by a long distance done yet. In her room on the guest level, Vale sat on the edge of the sleeping surface and looked at her hands and felt the weight of what had just happened settling in the way deep space cold settles into hull metal slowly, thoroughly, and with the absolute certainty of something that is not going to get warmer. She had just ended her career. She had just severed herself from every professional and social structure that her life in the Larathi diplomatic caste had been built on. She had just told a full galactic assembly session that the evidence she had been sent to provide was being manipulated by the Accord Division for political purposes, and she had backed it with a biological record that the Assembly's own protocols would have to spend considerable time responding to. And underneath all of that, quiet and insistent, was the Yathara, still there, even now, like a signal that did not stop just because the receiver had put down the instrument. She pressed her hand to her own sternum and felt her own heartbeat and thought about the human in the waiting room, who did not know what had happened and who was sitting with the not knowing the way she had once watched him, sit with the drift medium, with the stillness of someone who trusted that the situation would hold them even before they knew what the situation was. She thought, he trusted me before he knew if he should. She thought, I owe him the same. The emergency procedural session that Val Prime Sareth convened within 2 hours of the testimony was not technically a session of the full assembly. It was a compact review, a mechanism in the Galactic Accord's procedural rulebook that allowed a faction representative to request a rapid administrative review of evidence entered under irregular protocol activation. Sareth had written the specific clause of the mechanism in question 6 years earlier for exactly this kind of contingency. What he had not accounted for, because at the time he wrote it, there was no reason to account for it, was what happened when the emergency session convened and the other representatives in the room found themselves with the biological record on the table and the fact that had attempted to have a witness's memory altered still in the air. He had also not accounted for Elder Sovan. Elder Sovan had been in Accord Division custody for approximately 14 hours when the timer on the transmission he had queued reached 0 and released it into the station's general communication system. Not a broadcast. He was not trying to create a scene, and he had known for a long time that creating scenes was not the most effective tool for the kind of change he was interested in. What he released was a targeted message, one message, sent simultaneously to every Larathi representative in the station or in transmission range, which included 3 members of the current assembly session and 7 members of the broader diplomatic community that had gathered in the surrounding sector for the proceedings. The message was very short. It contained no words. It contained only the scanner's output from Cole's resonance. Scan the biological frequency, clean and precise and without commentary, and an authentication key that every Larathi in any of the diplomatic castes carried in their secure systems for exactly this kind of interspecies verification. The Larathi representatives received the message. Larathi genetics were not universal. Not every member of the species carried the gen marker at the depth that would produce a full resonance response. But the threshold for recognition for the lower register, the awareness of the Yethara, as distinct from background frequency, was considerably less demanding than the threshold for full resonance memory activation. And of the 10 Larathi who received Elder Sovan's message, 6 heard it. 6 beings in positions of diplomatic influence, who had just received biological evidence directly to their personal verification systems that the genetic record Vale had submitted to the assembly was not mythology, and was not manipulation, and was not irregular. It was, as Elder Sovan had known for 40 years, simply true. The compact review session was 17 minutes old when the first of those 6 requested the floor. Sareth saw it happening. He was good enough at his work to see it happening before it was fully visible. The way a structural engineer sees the stress pattern before the fracture appears. He had lost the procedural high ground when the resonance protocol activated legally. He had lost the evidentiary high ground when the assembly's own verification systems authenticated the genetic record. He was now watching the social and political high ground erode as 3 Larathi representatives in the room began asking questions about the coherence review that had been performed on a first witness during an active mission, and about the legal standards governing such reviews, and about who had authorized the specific pharmaceutical protocol used. He could answer the questions. He had answers. His answers were legally defensible, mostly, in the specific sense that they invoked procedural authorities that existed in the document that governed procedural authorities. But answering them in this room, with the genetic record sitting in the record and 6 Larathi hearing a frequency in the room that they were now actively trying to understand, was not going to produce the outcome he had calculated for. He stepped out of the session room into the corridor. Vale was there. She was not lurking. She was not hiding. She was standing in the corridor outside the session room with the specific posture of someone who had thought carefully about whether to be here and had decided that being here was the right answer and was now being here without apology. Her bioluminescence was low but steady. She was holding herself the way people hold themselves when they have already been through the worst thing that is going to happen today and are no longer afraid of the afternoon. Sareth looked at her for a moment. Then he said, "You understand what you have done to yourself?" "Yes," Vale said. "Your caste designation, your certification, your professional standing." He said it without malice, purely as information, the way a person states the known consequences of a known action. The Larathi Observer's Compact does not provide protection for witnesses who deviate from their assigned testimony. Your record will reflect this deviation permanently. "I know," Vale said. "And you chose this," Sareth said. "I chose to submit the record of what I actually observed," Vale said. The record includes biological evidence that is now authenticated by the Assembly's own systems. What I chose is not the complication, what I chose is the data. The complication is that the data does not support what you needed it to say. Sareth looked at her for a moment with eyes that were the color of deep water, and had a specific quality, not cruel, not angry, but the quality of a man who had built his understanding of the universe around a particular architecture and was watching a structural component of that architecture fail. You understand, he said, more quietly, that what you have entered into the record changes everything that has been built here. 17 factions, 400 years of accord law, the entire framework of how galactic civilization has been organized since before your grandparents were born. I understand that, Vale said, and you are prepared to answer for that. She was quiet for a moment, and when she spoke, her voice had the tone of something that had been considered for a long time and had finally resolved. I am prepared to answer for submitting accurate biological evidence to a proceeding that was trying to use false premises to permanently remove a species from the galactic community, she said. If the framework you're describing cannot accommodate accurate evidence, I think the framework has a problem that I didn't create. Sareth looked at her for a very long moment. Then he said, I want you to understand something. I have not been doing this out of hatred. I have not been doing this because I believe humans are inferior, or barbaric, or any of the other words that get used in these arguments. He paused. I have been doing this because I have spent 30 years studying the long arcs of galactic history, and I have seen what happens when a species with extraordinary unmodeled capacity enters a system that was not built to contain it. I have seen the disruptions, the extinctions, the collapses. He paused again. Humans are not the first species to arrive at this threshold. They are the first species to arrive at this threshold with these specific characteristics. And I do not know what they will do with what they are. And the not knowing is, there are very few things that have genuinely frightened me in 30 years of this work. That is one of them. Vale looked at him for a long moment. I know, she said, and I think your fear is real, and I think your history is real. She paused, and I think that the human I spent 3 days observing refused an order that would have killed 900 Lyrathi civilians at significant personal cost, because it was wrong. And I think that when he found out who I was and what I was there to do, he reported it to his own delegation instead of asking me to stop, because he thought that the people's decisions about humanity's future deserved to have accurate information. And I think that when Elder Sovan gave him the option to sign a consent form that could either help humanity or be used against it, and he genuinely did not know which, he signed it anyway. And I don't know what humans will do with whatever they are either, she said. But I heard his heartbeat, Sareth. I heard it. And whatever is in it, whatever the makers put into this species that we've been carrying the recognition of for 9,000 years. It's not something I'm afraid of. Sareth looked at her for a long time. His face was very still. Then he turned and went back into the session room, and the door closed behind him, and Vale stood alone in the corridor. With the quiet around her and the sound of the Assembly's ventilation system, moving air through the station in a slow, steady rhythm that was not the Yathara but was, in its own way, consistent. She stood there for a while. Then she went to find Cole. He was in the holding room that the Accord officers had put him in, and the Accord officers outside it were not detaining him legally. They could not detain him. He was an Alliance diplomatic witness, but they had made it structurally difficult for him to know that the holding room's door was not locked until he tested it, which he had apparently just done when she arrived at the corridor outside, because the door opened from the inside just as she was raising her hand to knock. He looked at her. She looked at him. He said, "You look terrible." "I feel approximately that," she said. "Are you all right?" "I've been in a room with no windows for 4 hours," he said. "I've had worse." He looked at her with the specific, calibrated attention she had learned to recognize over 3 days of being its object. "What happened?" "I submitted the record," she said. Elder Sovan sent the frequency to every Lyrathi in range before they could stop him. The compact review is not going the way Sareth expected it to go. She paused. The vote has been suspended pending a full assembly review of the biological evidence, which will take, she stopped. It will take time. It will not be simple. and it is possible that the Assembly will find a procedural mechanism to dismiss the evidence anyway, because the Accord is very old and very layered, and there are people in it who are very good at finding mechanisms. She paused. But it is also possible that they won't, and humanity's expulsion is not happening today. Cole was quiet for a moment. He looked at her with something that she still could not entirely read, because he was a person who did not put everything he felt in his face, and she had only had 3 days to learn the parts of him that were readable. But the parts she could read showed her something that looked, she thought, like the particular kind of relief that comes not from things going well, but from having made a bet that had at least not gone immediately and obviously wrong. "All right," he said. "All right," she said. "It's more than I had an hour ago," he said. He leaned against the doorframe. "How are you doing?" Vale stood in the corridor and thought about this question. She had been asked some version of this question before, usually in context where the answer was social lubrication, and the specific truth of it was not particularly relevant. She thought about answering it the same way now, and found that she did not want to, which was its own kind of data point about what 3 days had done to her default behaviors. "I have lost my position," she said. "My designation. The professional standing that I spent 11 years building in the Observer's Compact. I have publicly contradicted an assignment from the Accord Division in front of a full assembly session, which means that any diplomatic future I had in the current structure is essentially—" She stopped. "Gone," she said. "It is gone." He was looking at her steadily. Not with pity, she had been half-braced for pity, and was relieved to find it absent. With the quality of attention of someone who was listening because they had something they intended to say once the full picture was in place. "And you were right," he said. "Yes," she said. "I was right." She looked at him. "Being right doesn't change what it cost." "No," he said, "it doesn't." He straightened from the doorframe. "I know what that feels like." "I know you do," she said. She stopped. "That is part of why I submitted the record, because I watched you make that decision, and I watched what it cost you, and I watched you be still present, still here, still making choices that you believed were right. And I thought that if you could do that, the least I could do was be honest about what I observed." She paused. "That is a very small version of what you did." "It's not small," he said. She looked at him for a moment. Her bioluminescence was running at the low, steady gold of exhaustion, and she was aware of it the way you are aware of your own heart rate after something hard as a sign of where you are and what it took to get here. "Then you're in good company," she said, and it came out differently than she had intended it to, more quietly and more personally, and she was not sure it was exactly the right thing to say. Cole looked at her with an expression that did something she recognized as being equivalent, in its specific quality, to the sound she had made in the drift chamber when the nebula hit its transition. A thing that was not planned, a thing that happened because the situation produced it, and the person producing it had decided to stop preventing it. "You want to get out of this corridor?" he said. "Very much," she said. They went to Stellar Drift. Not because the drift chamber was the obvious destination for a day that had gone the way this one had gone. Because it was the one place on the station that was not a hearing room or a corridor outside a hearing room or an administrative space where things were being decided. Because the nebula was there, and the nebula continued doing what it had always done, and that was, right now, the most reliable thing either of them had access to. The evening session had reduced the chamber's occupancy. There were a few guests in the far end, drifting in the easy, unhurried way of people who had come to stellar drift for uncomplicated reasons. The nebula was in its blue phase, moving toward the gold, and the light from below, the medium, had that quality it got in the evening cycle when the chamber's ambient system dimmed to let the nebula's own light carry more of the work. They stepped off the platform. The medium caught them and held them, and the buoyancy was exactly what it had been 3 days ago. And Cole floated on his back and looked at the dying star above them, and Vale drifted beside him in the specific way she had developed over 3 days, upright enough to maintain visual orientation, but close enough that the medium's slow current kept bringing them back toward each other when they drifted apart. For a while, neither of them said anything. He said, "Eventually, the assembly review is going to take months. At minimum," she said, "possibly longer. The evidence is authenticated, but authentication and acceptance are not the same thing in the Accord. There will be challenges, counter-filings, additional review panels." She paused. It will not be simple. No, he said, it never is. He looked at the nebula. But it's in the record now. Yes, she said, it is in the record. He said, Elder Sovan. Do you know if he is still in custody, she said. But the legal basis for holding him beyond 48 hours is not strong, and some of the Larathi representatives who heard the transmission are already asking about it. A pause. He knew what he was doing. He knew all of it before he came to you in the observation ring. He knew what it would cost him, Cole said. Yes, she said. He is known for a long time. He has been carrying this for a very long time, waiting for the right circumstances. She was quiet for a moment. I think he waited for you. Cole was still. For a human. For a specific human, she said. For the human who, when given the choice between the safe order and the right one, chose the right one and put it in writing. He needed someone whose record, already public, already examined, already in the Assembly's proceedings, could make the consent filing meaningful, could make the resonance scan legally undeniable before it was ever used. She paused. He chose you before either of us arrived here. Cole absorbed this for a while. That's either very flattering or very unsettling, he said. It is both, she said. It is also exactly what it is. He looked at the nebula. The blue phase had shifted, and the first wash of gold was starting to show at the edges, the transition point, the moment she had made the involuntary sound. 3 days ago, and what felt like considerably longer. She was watching it, now with the attention of someone who had decided to pay attention to the things that produced involuntary sounds in her, because apparently the things that produced involuntary sounds were carrying information. When the review is done, he said, assuming it goes even partially the way it should. What happens to you? She thought about this carefully. I will not have a position in the Observer's Compact, she said. Or in the Accord Division, obviously. My Larathi family caste will require management. There are relationships and obligations and expectations that will need to be renegotiated, some of them significantly. She paused. I will be the first witness who submitted the record that changed the biological status of humanity in the galactic community. That is either a distinction or a liability depending on who is evaluating it and when.
She paused again, possibly both simultaneously.
So you'll be complicated, Cole said. She looked at him, and something in the precision of his phrasing made her want to make the sound she had made at the nebula's transition, which she did not, because she had enough self-management for that, but the impulse was there. Yes, she said, I will be complicated. I've been complicated for 18 months, he said. It's manageable. She was quiet for a moment. The gold was spreading across the ceiling now, the charged particles beginning their individual resolution, the moment approaching when the whole vast ceiling of dying light would become separate and distinct and countable, each particle its own point in a field of 10,000 years of slow, unwitnessed brilliance. Cole, she said. Yeah, in the drift medium the first day. When you kept still, she paused. I wrote in my notes that evening that I did not have a behavioral framework that accounted for it. I said the performance hypothesis didn't fit. She paused again. What I did not write is that when I was lying on your chest, tracking your heartbeat, she stopped, reorganized. I have never in my life felt that kind of recognition. I am a scientist. I have very precise language for most of what I experience. Because precision is how I manage experience and turn it into something I can work with. I do not have precise language for that. He said, without looking away from the nebula, what did it feel like? Like finding something I didn't know I was looking for, she said. Like the first line of a text you have been studying for years and have never understood, and then suddenly understanding it, and understanding that you have always understood it, and that you just didn't have the context yet. The transition hit. The gold opened into the particle visibility phase, and the ceiling of the chamber became 10,000 separate points of light, each one a specific location in the dying of a 10,000-year star, each one its own fact about where things were and had been and were going. She did not make a sound this time. She just watched it. He watched it with her. After the 90 seconds, the gold began to consolidate again, and the particles merged back into the general luminescence, and the chamber moved back toward the familiar wash of color that it had been before. And they floated in it, held by something that had been compressing the remnant of a dead star into something breathable for the entire time that all of this had been happening, indifferent to all of it, and completely reliable. They're going to want me at Tessara, he said eventually. The Alliance delegation, review proceedings, testimony about my own record. He paused. Probably a lot of very long days in rooms with no windows. Yes, she said. The assembly review will require depositions from all material witnesses, including me. She paused. We will both be in Tessara. That's something, he said. Yes, she said. It is something. The medium drifted them slightly apart, and the slow current brought them slightly back, the way it had been doing for 3 days, and neither of them moved to stop it or to make anything different from what it was. The nebula cycled toward Violet. Outside the station, in the drift of the Orith Nebula's outer field, the Assembly's legal machinery was already beginning the long, complicated process of examining what a biological record meant for the framework of galactic civilization. Sareth was in a consultation room, doing the mathematics of which walls were still standing, and which needed to be defended, and which had already fallen and could not be recovered, because he was a careful man, and even careful men had to acknowledge when the terrain had changed. Elder Sovan was in a holding room that was going to have to release him within 38 hours, and he was sitting in it with the specific quality of patience that comes from spending 40 years waiting for the right circumstances, and knowing, now, that the right circumstances had arrived. In the drift chamber, 2 beings who had come to stellar drift for different reasons floated in the medium of a dying star and did not talk about any of it for a while. Later, when the violet phase came, Vale said, I do not know what happens now. Neither do I, Cole said. Usually that's the part I don't like. And now? He was quiet for a moment, and the nebula light moved through its colors above them, and he said, Now it's just what it is. She looked at him in the violet light, and his face was the face of someone who had put down the weight of knowing the outcome and was standing in the uncertainty the way he had stood in the drift medium on the first day, still, and trusting the situation to hold him, and present. She thought, that is the most human thing I have ever seen. She thought, I understand now why it sounds the way it does. The medium drifted them apart, and the medium brought them back, and the Orith Nebula continued doing what it had always done, which was dying, and being beautiful about it, and not needing anything from anyone to be exactly what it was. Somewhere in the Assembly's records, in the authenticated and entered, and legally undismissible biological record of a Lirathi first witness, receiving the Yethera from a human man in a drift chamber in the outer reaches of the nebula, the frequency of a heartbeat played on in the document, the way music plays on in the air, after the instrument stops, not diminishing, just becoming part of everything that surrounds it, waiting for the next time someone is close enough and quiet enough to hear.